Alright, so we've talked about populations of animals and how they can become dispersed and separated, and which leads to speciation and evolution. It's also to realize that there's a reason why animals don't cover the globe entirely, why certain animals live in certain areas. So there are these ideas of biogeographic regions, okay? And these are large areas, usually continent-wide, that have the ability for animals to move between different areas, right? But there are barriers that are usually large, like oceans or deserts, that animals can't cross. So for instance, the Near Arctic Biological Geographic Transition Zone is basically North America. The Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean are so wide that very few animals get across that unless they have a ship or a boat. So this kind of keeps plants and animals separate. Right here in southern Mexico, very, very dry, arid lands, enough of a desert that very few plants can make that boundary. And so we have a very different type of animal and plant situation down here in South America than North America, because they don't interact very often. Same thing here with what they call the Ethiopian versus the Palearctic. In North Africa, the animals and plants are much more closely related to those in Europe and Asia, because there's much more connection. The Sahara Desert is so hot and dry and wide that very few living things can cross that boundary. And so you have a much different type of plants and animals down here. Oceans, in this case large mountains, barriers that stop most of the movement. Now that's not to say that in that entire huge region that animals move freely between all of North America. There are actually boundaries within North America, and what those are depend on the animal. And what type of boundary it is depends on the niche and the habitat. So the niche is this area that a species fits into. So butterflies, monarch butterflies, need to have temperatures that are above freezing, and they need to have areas where the milkweed plant grows, because they only eat milkweed and they can't handle below freezing temperatures. That's their niche. Okay? So anywhere that has those requirements, right? Now, it may not be that specific. Certain types of plants in the desert, they need to have a certain amount of dryness. Cactuses don't do well with too much water. So that could be part of their niche. An area that is somewhat dry and has a lot of sun. They need a lot of sun, for instance. Or an animal that needs water. So let's just say an animal that, it's an aquatic mammal that needs warm water with plants. That's a niche. So plants close to the surface. So that is, say, southern Florida, where you have warm water, lots of lagoons and swamps, and that's where the sea cows and manatees live. That's their niche, right? So that is the specific resources they need. When we actually find the location, like South Florida, that's a habitat. The habitat is the physical area that has all the conditions that the niche requires. Okay? So knowing that, animals have two different ways of approaching this: specialized and generalized. So as you would think, animals that have a very specific need of things are specialists. Maybe they can only eat one type of seed, or they need a very specific temperature range. So the more narrow their niche, the smaller their habitats. They're a generalist, like the yellow-eared parrot. Okay? In fact, some animals can be so specialized that they only live in that one spot in the world. So the yellow-eared parrot only lives in these small areas in Colombia. It is so specialized that once you get too far beyond this, the barriers, the plants they need, and the habitat they need does not exist. They don't live here. So much so that they have basically confined themselves to this. Now, something in these areas does enough for them that they're able to reproduce quite well. But endemic species have that one issue we'll talk about, is that because it's a smaller area, if something happens, they don't have the ability to move very widely, which is the generalist's benefit. Okay? So the peregrine falcon lives almost everywhere in the world because its niche is relatively simple. It just basically needs animals to eat. It doesn't care if it's fish or if it's rodents, whatever it can get. It's not too picky. It can live in a variety of temperatures, warm and cold, right? So a broad species, you can see right here that the peregrines live basically everywhere. They may move a little bit now and then because maybe they can't have it quite too cold, but for the most part, they find everywhere. But this brings up the idea of limiting factors, right? So what stops an animal from living everywhere? Anything that stops it from reproducing. That's a reproductive limiting factor. So the amount of food, the amount of animals that eat them, that kind of a thing. Or the geographic potential. If you're an animal that has to eat milkweed, then you can't live further north or south than where milkweed grows. That's a limiting factor. So biological are things that affect life. So predation, how much light, the temperature, okay? Here's an example. And then physical factors, the environment. So light, if you're a plant, you need a certain amount of light. Some plants need really, really bright light, some not so much, but the amount of light available. Or temperature. Some animals cannot live in the extreme cold. They don't have the ability to. So that's a physical force, their environment, right? Or water, how much water is available. And then biological factors, predation. You know, if you're an animal that, can't outrun many other animals, you're easy prey, then you need to, that kind of limits you. You have to live in an environment that allows you to hide, right? Or allows you to have some way to overcome that. Competition for resources. There are more than one type of species out there, and if you're an animal that only eats one plant and there's another one out there that eats that same plant, right, you're both competing for that resource. So you better have a way to overcome that, or you're going to be really in trouble. Okay? And here's the thing. If the limiting factor becomes too severe, the species can't reproduce. And once a species can't reproduce, then they can't make new animals, new plants. They go extinct. And extinction is permanent. Alright, so let's get back into some more detailed ones. So light. This is important with plants. So some plants need a lot of light. They call them heliophytes. They love the sun. So if you are a plant that is a heliophyte, you're not going to do very well in northern Canada, where half the year it's dark, right? Whereas a plant that is shady is not going to grow well in the middle of a wide open field, but it might grow better in a forest. So light is a big issue for plants. Probably the biggest issue for plants, though, is temperature. Some plants do not handle freezing temperature at all. Like I've said before in many other classes, we don't see banana trees going in Chicago, right? It's not because we don't have dirt and water, it's because we're not warm enough, right? So temperature is a big factor for plants. Animals somewhat, although animals have evolved the response, some animals can actually control their internal temperature. We call them warm-blooded or endotherms. So for instance, we can live as humans in a cold environment because we are able to maintain a body temperature that is above freezing, right? Otherwise, if we were a cold-blooded animal like a alligator here, right? And cold-blooded animals or picotherms cannot regulate their body temperature. So if the alligator is outside and the temperature drops to 45 degrees, his body cools down to 45 degrees, which limits how effective he is at moving and actually alive. So if the temperature goes below freezing, they will freeze. That's why you don't see many lizards or alligators at the North Pole, right? Some animals have ways of getting around this, right? So some animals migrate, so they basically move away from the limiting factor. So birds can move when it's north and cold. Some animals just basically sleep. So think about bears, right? In the middle of winter when it's really cold and there's less food and it's hard to live, the bears go in, they sleep it off. Okay? The eastern phoebe is another example, right? So here they are. Their year-round area here is in purple. So here you can find this bird year-round. But in the summer, they'll go as far north here as almost to Alaska. But that's only in the summer. In the winter, they'll go maybe this far south. But this is kind of that boundary, right? So their habitat, right, really kind of depends. They basically move to avoid the issues of heat. One thing we have noticed with animals in regards to heat, especially in the form of mammals, because mammals are warm-blooded animals. So animals that are warm-blooded tend to be much more compact in cold climates. More compact, shorter legs, shorter ears. And in hotter climates, they have longer ears. And that's because, quite simply, this. Think about when you're cold, right? What do you do when you're cold? You kind of bundle up and kind of like this. You conserve heat. When you're hot, right, you spread out. You allow the heat to kind of radiate. And so these are all basically rabbits. Different species of rabbits. But the further north you go, you see that they still have long ears. But look at the legs here on the Arctic hare versus the jackrabbit, right? In fact, you can actually look at human populations, and populations of people that have lived for thousands of years in warmer areas tend to, on average, have slightly more longer arms and legs. And we're talking like minuscule, but it does affect people to that extent. Water is also a physical factor because, one, all animals need water. Now, how much water can they get by on? That's a different story, but that's why deserts have very few animals and plants, because there's less water. Some plants need a lot of water. So water lilies have to be immersed. They are hydrophytes. They must have wet water. Rice is a hydrophile. Some animals are mesophytes. They can handle periods of drought. Most plants are considered mesophytes that do not live in water. So grass, for instance. The ones that live in deserts or really dry areas, they call those xerophytes. They've adapted to very little bit of water, and basically they've adapted like water storage systems. So here's an example of a cactus, right? So one of the things cactus do, I told you about, they have the spines, which basically keep animals from eating them. They kind of have this thick body, if you will, which can expand, almost like a sponge, to hold water. Another thing is they have very few leaves, right? Those leaves, those spines, are basically just tiny little leaves, because leaves give off water through evaporation, so they've cut that down. They usually have a very big root that kind of covers a large area to capture any water. Another thing, if you're not a gardener, you may not know this, but some plants only live 1 year. Okay, those are annuals. So you plant the spring in the summer, in the spring. The plant grows during the summer. In the fall, it flowers and produces more seeds, which fall into the ground, and then they lay dormant. And over the winter, that plant dies, but next year the seeds grow. So annuals basically live 1 year, whereas perennials are plants like trees that live year after year. Now, why would that be an evolutionary strategy? Well, if you can't get water, say in the winter, some places are very dry during the winter, so a perennial escapes that water stress by dying. They literally grow, and then they create a seed for next year that lays dormant during the dry season. Or perennials, which basically go into hibernation. So that's why trees go into hibernation in the winter. I love these trees. They're called baobab trees. You find these in Madagascar. Madagascar is this island off the coast of Africa that is far enough away from the land that there's not a lot of movement. So some of the plants here evolved here and nowhere else in the world. This always reminds me of some weird science fiction movie. And what they've done is they have these very, very thick trunks that are basically big sponges to hold water. It is dry for a large part of the year in Madagascar, and very few leaves because it's very sunny, so they don't need a lot of leaves, right? Just enough, which allows them to have these thick, spongy tree trunks. A biological limiting factor is predation. In other words, what eats you, okay? So if you're an animal that eats other animals, right, there has to be enough animals for you to eat. If there's not enough in that environment, that would be a limiting factor. So oftentimes, if you're a predator, specifically too, your geographical range is determined by areas that have enough plants or animals where you live. So what type of food do you eat? So let's go back, right, to that idea of predator. So a native predator, like the peregrine falcon, right, it may eat a lot of stuff, a lot of rabbits. Okay, but what happens if it eats so many rabbits there's none left? Okay, well, here's what happens. A native predator over time has found that if it eats all these animals, right, it's found other animals to eat. So it's kind of evolved that way. That's why peregrine falcons live in a lot of environments. They can eat a lot of things. But what happens if you bring the peregrine falcon to a new environment where it's never been before, right? And there are a lot of mice, and it eats all those mice. Right? Well, now what happens is those mice are extinct. But the falcon has the ability to prey switch. It can find more food. But some birds can't. And those birds that can't go extinct. So what happens is usually non-native animals, animals that are invasive species, will hunt a prey to extinction because they haven't evolved over time with them. Right? Animals that would do that, native animals that would hunt to extinction, go extinct themselves. That's why you don't find them naturally. When humans interfere with this process, like with the Nile perch, that's when you get that issue with extinction. So So here's an example right here with butterflies. So we know monarch butterflies live in these areas in the summer, and they spend the winter either down here in Mexico or on the coast. But we also know that their range is limited. We never find them farther north than this line, and that is because, as studies have shown, this is as far north as milkweed grows. So that's their northern limit. And then in this area, the Rocky Mountains, the elevation is such it doesn't grow either. That is a line, if you will, a limiting factor. All right, we're going to pause right here for station identification, and we'll be back in just a moment.